What are the ramifications of the new stimulus package enacted by the Biden administration? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. This is this week's segment of the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the principled case for libertarianism in the context of what's going on in the world. I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, professor of economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
Good to see you too, and to be with our viewers and listeners as always.
Thanks for tuning in. We've got a great conference going on called the National Security State and the Kennedy assassination. We've had two segments, one of which has already been posted in case you need to catch up. The second one will be posted any day now. We've got 600 and I think we're up to 680 registrations now. So I'd love to have you join us next Wednesday at 7 p.m. and continuing regularly thereafter through May. We've actually expanded it by adding two new speakers. Those speakers will be added to our schedule within the next week or so, and powerful speakers. This is one of the best conferences we've ever put on. So if you're not registered and you're not attending, you're missing something really good. Also, if you're new, subscribe to our FFF Daily, to our YouTube channel, et cetera, et cetera. All right, Richard, you must be really excited because, well, I mean, look, they just passed a $1.9 trillion stimulus plan. I mean, like, that should make everybody so excited that the economy is going to be stimulated again. I mean, Richard, what planet do these people live on? I mean, this is incredible. And, you know, of course, everybody's ecstatic. The airlines are ecstatic that they're getting all this free money. And I mean, just think what a benevolent government is. You know, you have like a Santa Claus. It's the federal government that operates as Santa Claus all year long. It's just able to give out free money because it's wealthy, it's rich. I mean, that's really the implicit assumption behind all this is that our Uncle Sam is the richest uncle in the whole world, and he's got just gobs of money to pass out to everybody. And of course, nobody asks, where's the money coming from? I mean, this is a broke government. This is a deadbeat government. And yet it's saying, hey, look, man, we just found $1.9 trillion. Well, of course, libertarians, Austrian economists, which you are, we know what's going on. It is a scam. It's a scam older than recorded history, or maybe not that old. But where the government...
You were there back then.
I was there. Yeah, I remember well. You know, they go out and they borrow the money out of the capital markets, or they just print the money. And so we're definitely, I mean, what the national debt, the federal government's debt is up to now 28 trillion. This will get it pretty close to 30 trillion. And they don't care. I mean, they take that same attitude, you know, that we learned in economics classes in college that, oh, the federal government's debt doesn't matter because we owe it to ourselves. Yeah, try telling the bondholders that have invested their money in government bonds, that it doesn't matter. Well, of course it matters, and we've seen this throughout history. We just recently, we see what happened with Greece and with Italy, other third world countries that saddle themselves with so much debt that they finally start to crater. And then you end up with a financial crisis, you end up with a monetary crisis, a debt crisis, and we all know what happens then. The government gets vicious. It needs money bad, and that's Roosevelt confiscated gold in the 30s. I wouldn't be surprised at all if they don't U.S. officials don't follow the lead of what happened in Argentina, where Argentinian officials just seized everybody's retirement accounts, replaced them with government bonds. And then, of course, you've got the continued devaluation of the dollar, which has harmed throughout the decades, ever since the Federal Reserve was established, people on fixed incomes. This is a racket. I mean, that's really what it is. It's a racket that they cause all these bankruptcies and financial and economic distress with their mandatory lockdowns. And then they say, well, we've broken your legs, but we're going to give you a free crutch here. By the way, that you're going to have to pay for either through taxation to pay for the debt or through devalued dollars that you're earning at work. It's just a huge racket, and it's not going to end well, Richard. I will guarantee you this is not going to end well. What do you think?
Two men are sitting at a bar together, commiserating. And one says to the other, you know, my wife is a Keynesian. Whenever she gets in a depression, she spends money we don't have. You know, what can I say? To begin with, why are we in this situation? Because the government chose to bring the U.S. economy to a halt. You know, this, you know, even in a Keynesian framework, this is not, quote, a normal recession. The economy in a year ago, okay, 1 year ago, was at what economists normally define as full employment. 3.6% of the labor force was unemployed. Okay, that's by any econ textbook, when they talk about this, that's full employment. The economy was growing. Standards of living were rising. And then this virus strikes, and the government orders this mandatory lockdown. Don't go to work, don't go shopping, stop producing. You can only sell these goods to members of the society defined as essential in terms of food or pharmaceuticals. Otherwise, just stop what you're doing. Well, why should we be surprised that the economy went through this huge tailspin of falling revenues, disappearing profits, lost jobs, consumed savings to live off, this entire disaster in the economy? Yes, the worst of it only lasted for about 2.5, 3 months. Then the state governments, and it's not just the federal government, a lot of the bulk of this nonsense was done by state governments, California, New York, and a bunch of others. Okay. And then they started easing up, and the economy had started recovering a little bit. But the states still lock us down in various ways. They restrict hours, they restrict businesses. The federal government is hovering over and saying this, that, and the other with its own mandatory rules and regulations. So the economy has been in this year-long disaster. Now, what's the government's responses? Well, maybe we shouldn't be locking down the economy in the face of this coronavirus crisis. Maybe if we look at the histories of previous epidemics and viruses, maybe we should leave it to private sector ways of finding solutions to this in terms of getting people by and vaccines and so on, but let the market work. No, they impose central planning on the economy, a lockdown, shutdown, central planning. And then, it's sort of like, the guy who's surprised says, I'm shocked. I'm shocked. Look, people are out of work. Look, businesses are failing. How could this have happened just because I told everybody to stop producing and stay home? It can't be my fault, but I have the answer. I'm going to give people money to make up for all of the lost revenues and incomes that they've been not having because I told them not to work and not to produce. And I told them so because I have the governmental club of political coercive authority. So in a nutshell, the US government has spent over the last year, not just this 1.9, this is over $6 trillion of funny money that the government has been injecting into the economy through deficits, with the vast bulk of it covered by the Federal Reserve System just creating new money. The government issues these securities. That's how they get the debt. They borrow the money, but who's borrowing the money from? People lend the government money, but then the government borrows the government securities that these people have taken in return for the borrowed money and create paper money. And then the Fed is holding the government treasuries. Okay, so it's all money created. And so all that they're doing is not only creating this huge debt overhang, in the sense that we now have over $27.5 trillion of debt. The Congressional Budget Office, right? These are just the statisticians and the economists who work for Congress. They're supposed to be nonpartisan, unbiased. The policy wonks, they're the number crunchers. They said that looking over the next 10 years, the debt is going to grow by a minimum of another $10 trillion beyond this, with the presumption that the virus either diminishes or basically is gone in terms of its impact on people. Okay. So another 10, and their long-term projection of until the middle of the 20th century, you know, when you and I will only be about 34 years old. I mean, they're talking about a possibility of the total debt at that time being equal to 200% of US GDP. Okay, that is huge. But even and now, why is this going on? Okay, why is this going on? Oh, we have to help people. Okay, first of all, it's bad economics, because first of all, the way the government spends the deficit dollars creates employments in certain places, investment opportunities in particular corners of the market, and are only maintainable, sustainable, as long as the government keeps injecting the money that in certain ways to create these patterns of demand, patterns of profits, patterns of employment opportunities. If and when the deficit spending either stops or slows down, that employment and investment and production house of cards just collapses. That's part of the Austrian criticism of Keynesian economics. It's not enough to say, oh, we have more stuff, we have more people working. How have you employed them? In what sectors of the economy? Doing what kind of work? What are the relative demands compared to the supplies that you're generating with these government dollars that may be out of balance with a sustainable private sector demand for things? But why are they doing this? Certainly the Democrats, but to be honest, at the end of the day, Republicans too, if they were in charge, if Trump had won the re-election, if the Republicans held on and held control of Congress, it just would have been a different variation of what the Democrats are doing. But the Democrats are doing this intentionally. Why? Create more groups that are increasingly dependent upon government handouts, government entitlement programs. Make them permanent, make them irreversible, even if the Republicans come back into power. Because you see, once they're in place, you know, you don't get elected by telling voters no. You get elected by telling voters yes in terms of a horn of goody plenties. So the Republicans will just keep on this, but it's basically a way to lock in more groups dependent upon the government. Certainly Democrats, but also Republicans, that then they're hooked. And then all these emergency programs are permanent. You want to keep getting them. Look how much you're dependent upon these government dollars coming for purpose X and purpose Y and purpose Z for you and your family. You need to reelect us. You have to assure that the dollars keep flowing. And don't worry. We're going to tax maybe the rich more down the road, those greedy corporations. But, you know, don't worry about it. We can always just borrow again this year, always kicking the can down the road. But where does it eventually lead to? What you were saying, Jacob, absolutely 100%. And that is a day of reckoning comes. When our day of reckoning comes, compared to when the Greek one did, or the Italian one, or as you were pointing out in Argentina, who the hell knows? No one has a crystal ball like that. But like causes bring about like effects. And there will come a point in which the government cannot keep borrowing, okay, to meet its needs, because the creditors refuse to extend more loans. The economy gets too inflated with paper money. The congressional, one more point before I shut up. The Congressional Budget Office recently released their 10-year projected estimate for government spending and taxing and deficits and debt. And they show that the deficits continue looking over the next 10 years. But then they break down the deficit. How much is what is called current deficit spending? In other words, a dollar borrowed just to cover, you know, some guy's welfare check or unemployment check or whatever. And how much of the deficit will be borrowed dollars to pay the interest on the prior debt that has accumulated? And you look at the wedge of the continuing deficit, the portion that is borrowed dollars to pay debt on previous debt accumulated is getting bigger and bigger. Well, what happens when 9 out of every $10 borrowed is just to pay interest on private debt accumulated. That is not sustainable, because that means you either borrow even more dollars to keep the dollars flowing for all the programs you've promised, or then you're in a day of reckoning and you don't get enough to hand out the goodies to everyone who have become dependent upon you. And at that point, the political reckoning arrives.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty easy to understand if we just think in terms of a family. That let's say a family is pulling in $50,000 annual income,
Right.
and their expenditures are 40,000.
Mm-hmm.
And all of a sudden they go out and say, well, we want extra stuff this year. We want a new Lexus. We want to go on a European vacation. They go out and borrow $20,000. All right, so now they got $20,000 in debt, and they've got to cover that. Well, they've got enough to cover it. They make 50 and they spend 40, so they got that 10. But let's assume they just keep doing that each year, adding more and more and more debt. It finally gets to a point where they don't have enough to cover their expenses plus the interest on their debt.
Correct.
Even if the bank's willing to roll over the debt, they go in there and they say, well, we want to borrow another 20 this year for extra stuff. And the banker says, you're not even covering your interest. Just cover your interest and I'll roll over your debt. Well, we can't. We don't have enough money. We got our expenses, children's clothing and so forth. Well, that's when the gig's up. And that's what you're talking about here. This is what happens to all these countries. It's what happened to Greece, that they were covering up. They were lying about the extent of the debt. But finally, the day of reckoning comes, that the tax revenues are not enough to cover all the welfare payments, the military payments, and the interest on the debt. And that's when it all gets exposed, because the bondholders are saying, hey, wait a minute, we want our money. You owe us much less the principal. They can't even think about paying the principal. And that's when the bankruptcy happens. Now, in the case of Greece, they were bailed out. But nobody's going to bail out the U.S. government. I guarantee you there's not one country in the world that's got the means or the desire to bail out this country. They're going to say, that's your tough luck. But the other alternative is the Fed, just as you point out, starts printing the money, just buys all these bonds up and with newly printed money. And we're talking about massive debasement. And if you look at the value of the dollar from the time the Federal Reserve was established, decade after decade, it's a constant devaluation, making the dollar worthless more and more as time goes by. I mean, remember, when we were growing up as kids, Richard, there were still silver coins circulating. There was silver quarters and silver dimes. This was the official money of the United States for more than a century. Silver coins and gold coins. Now, the gold coins obviously went out of circulation because the feds made it a felony to own gold coins after they nationalized gold coins. But silver coins, it was still legal to own them, and they were circulating. So why'd they go out of circulation? Well, it's Gresham's law in economics. Bad money forces out good money. That is, as the feds continued printing more money and printing these and coining these cheap alloyed coins, why should anybody use a silver coin to buy a soft drink, let's say a silver quarter, when you can use an alloyed coin to do it? Because your silver quarter, you might be able to go get 3 alloyed quarters for that, or 2. So nobody's going to be that stupid to use the silver coin when they can use the cheapened coin. And that's why we don't see silver coins in circulation anymore. So this is a process that governments have used throughout history. This is not a new racket. This is an old racket. Unfortunately, people don't recognize it. When prices start rising, I can guarantee you that they're going to be blaming it on external forces, sort of like, terrorism. That, oh my gosh, inflation has hit our country just like terrorism. We don't know the causes. We just happen to be the latest victim of this phenomenon. Well, the fact is they're responsible for the anger and hatred that produces the terrorism with their bombings and killings overseas. Well, they're also responsible for the debasement of the dollar, which can only be reflected in rising prices. But I guarantee you, they're going to start blaming it on those profiteers, big oil, the business owners. They're going to have the little buttons whip inflation now. They're going to get everybody all riled up about, hey, we got to collectively fight inflation. And unfortunately, a lot of people are going to fall for it. They're not going to realize that the root cause of this is this massive, ever-growing debt, ever-growing federal expenditures, and ever-growing debasement of the dollar.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Let me ask. So, you were talking about, the family that keeps borrowing. They want the Lexus, they want the European vacation, etc. But there's another aspect. It's the intergenerational aspect. Economists often point out you can't borrow against the future. In other words, any resources used today, you borrow today, have to be out of today's resources. But the burden of paying back what you're using today can be shifted to a future generation, in the sense you leave a debt to others to pay. So if I can do your metaphor of, the couple doing this, imagine that a mom and dad, their kids have grown up, and they decide, how many years do we really have left? Let's just go on a binge. We're going to spend all of our income. We're going to use up all of our savings, and we're going to now max out every credit card and line of credit that we have just to enjoy life before we die. And so then some years pass and they pass away. And then the creditors come, and just for the sake of my example, imagine that there was somewhere in a contract, yes, all of our debts are now legally required to be assumed by our children. How would their children feel if they suddenly find out that mom and dad not only used up all their income and own savings, but have maxed out credit cards and left them the legal obligation to pay for the tens of thousands of dollars, hundreds of thousands of dollars that they spent to have a good time before they croaked? That was their legacy to their children. Now, the fact is that this is what is happening. The dollars that were borrowed in the 1960s, the dollars that were borrowed in the 1970s, the 80s, the dollars being borrowed now are not being paid back completely or at all by the people who benefited from those government redistributions in that fashion. A lot of those people are dead, but we're stuck, the next generation, having to pay off the government debt, because that's part of the taxes collected. We have to pay off the debt of an early generation who had a redistribution of wealth. That makes it an intergenerational redistribution of wealth. We will be poorer because of what our parents and grandparents got as government favors and benefits. Now, it's worse today because those receiving things from the government, both in an absolute dollar term and as a percentage of the economic pie, gross domestic product, receive far more from the government. So the debt burden being left to children and grandchildren, and even great-grandchildren, is huge. That is what the current generation is leaving to their children and grandchildren. When we croak, have a nice day, you're going to have to see your wealth diminished to pay back what we borrowed and enjoyed life with. Now, one has to say, is not only the perversity of the economics of it, but what's the ethics of burdening your children and grandchildren with those future tax burdens so you could enjoy goodies from the government yourself today?
Yeah, no, it's the height of immorality. I mean, there's a moral responsibility for what's happening here. And I mean, and if you look at the inflationary aspects of this, you look at Venezuela and you can see what they've done with their medium of exchange there, their monetary system. I mean, their money is, you use 500,000, whatever the unit of exchange is there, to buy a loaf of bread. And we've seen this happen in history where there's hyperinflation. But Richard, what do you make of these progressives and these people that are writing these op-eds? It's really fascinating, saying this could never happen in the United States, that we have very responsible monetary central planners. Prices are only rising 2% at most, and these people really know what they're doing, and so we don't need to worry about this at all. What do you make of these people that are saying these things?
I think that it's two delusions. One delusion is that I actually think that there are some of them who actually believe, happy days are not only here again, but will never end. Look, the government can just borrow. Things are going well. We haven't had serious price inflation for well over a decade, if not longer. There's plenty of slack in the economy. There's no problem. And, why worry about it this year or over the next several years? Because if any problem arises, tomorrow will take care of itself. And at the same time, I think that besides delusions like that, okay, remember, people before the Great Depression thought America had entered a new era. In the 1920s, people thought they were a new era. Oh, there can never be another depression, okay? But besides that type of delusion about how the world works, in this case, the cause and effects of how the economy works, I think that there are those who are ideologically driven who may have that delusion, but don't give a damn. This is the way to get and sustain power. Do you think Nancy Pelosi cares about what is going to happen to taxpayers 10 years from now or 20 years from now? She's what, 80 years old? She'll either be, drooling in a mansion with all the money she's gotten, wearing her adult Pampers with someone feeding her because she can't feed herself, or she'll be dead by then. What does she care, right? She'll what, be in the House maybe another 1 or 2 terms, and that's it. And then it's left to other people, or those running today for office. Don't worry, I get elected today, and then, if an issue comes up, my reelection 2, 4, or 6 years from now, don't worry, that's kicking down the can. All that's important is, how do I get votes? How do I get people dependent upon me? And if they're ideological, how do we create the welfare state that we know is good for people, even though people are too stupid to realize it themselves? And let's hide the cost. So, sort of sneaking in this without giving people the check at the end of the meal, because the full value of the meal that we're feeding them today, well, it's really something that has to be paid off in the future. It's like putting it on the credit card and going to all these dinners all week, and you don't see how much it's cost you until the bill comes in next month.
Yeah, well, I think here in the waning moments of the program, it's incumbent on us to raise people's vision to what we really want here. I mean, I don't think it's sufficient, which is what a lot of libertarians are doing, is just criticizing the government for the lockdowns and the mask requirements and so forth. Any government program you can find fault with. It's almost a cottage industry. Whether it's immigration controls or drug laws or regulatory matters, you can always find, or cost overruns at the Pentagon, you can always find something to write on every single day. But we got to do more than that. We have to raise people's vision to what the ideal is, because that's what we're striving for. We're striving for a free society, not a better regulated society, a better managed society. The question that we want to challenge everybody with is, why should government play any role in healthcare at all? That's where we ought to be raising people's vision, is that we don't have government playing a role in religion. Why should it be playing a role in healthcare? And not only with respect to free or subsidized healthcare like Medicare and Medicaid, but also when a pandemic hits. Now, if imagine what life would have been like when the pandemic hit, which is a health threat, okay? Bad things happen in life. That doesn't necessarily mean that government's got a role in addressing them. Government's good at putting criminals in jail, but it's not good at handling health matters. And we see this right now in the vaccine. It's an absolute mess. Why? Because government's managing it. So imagine what life would have been like if there had been a separation of healthcare in the state. Yes, people would have gotten sick, but you would have had the healthcare industry leading the way out of this morass. They would have been providing the guidance. They would have been saying, this is what we recommend and so forth. There would have been no mandatory lockdowns. People would have decided for themselves how best to handle this, how best to keep their customers with the guidance that they were receiving from the healthcare professionals. We'd have come out of this on the other side a much better, healthier, stronger society. It's the same thing with money. Why should government be involved in the monetary sphere? Do they have any expertise? We know they don't. It's the exact opposite. You've got this monetary central planning, which, as you pointed out in your great book that FFF published, Monetary Central Planning in the State, it's just another socialist system. All these programs are just socialist systems. Why do we wonder why the results are so bad? So if we look at the ideal, we talk about separating money in the state, separating economy in the state. Why should the government be regulating, managing, controlling, or running an economy? We're talking about just people engaged in economic activity. They don't need government's interference or management or control. And then you separate healthcare in the state. Now we're talking about a real vibrant, prosperous, peaceful, harmonious, and moral society?
All I can say is that that is ultimately the point on the horizon to which all of our criticisms and proposals for change should be moving us. At the end of the day, it is merely a return to the vision, ideas, and principles upon which this country was founded. The founding fathers in general believed that individuals have a natural right to their life, their liberty, and honestly acquired property. And the purpose of government is to secure those liberties through police and the court system and rule of law. And other than that, people were viewed as rightly free to go about their own purposes, their own ways, in free and voluntary interaction with others. And that is the essence of a society of liberty and the foundation of its prosperity.
On that fine note, we'll wrap it up. Richard, enjoyed the conversation as always. Thank you all for tuning in. Thanks for your support. Remember, our conference continues next Wednesday night. You can register at our website at fff.org. Subscribe to FFF Daily, our YouTube channel. And Richard, I look forward to seeing you next week.
Until next time.